The summer of 1885 came in hard and hot, like a branding iron pressed against the plains. Sun hung high over the town of Sulphur Springs, a two-horse settlement skirting the edge of nowhere, where the wind stirred up dust devils and gossip in equal measure. That's where she was from, Ella Mae Granger, a woman with a gaze sharp as a hawk, and a past she didn't speak of much. Folks in town figured she'd come west to forget something, or someone. Never wore a ring, but the way she kept to herself, always working that little parcel of land out by Widow's Bluff, made folks wonder what kind of man she was running from. Truth was, Ella Mae wasn't running. She was waiting. Now, I ain't saying she believed in fate, but she sure kept one eye on the road, like she was expecting someone to come riding down it. Day in and day out, she worked that land with her bare hands, coaxing beans and tomatoes from the hard-pan dirt, sweating through every stitch of her calico dress. One July morning, hotter than a tin roof at noon, Ella Mae rode into town with a bushel of peaches she'd grown along the creek. Word had it, she was the only soul around who could get peaches to thrive in that scorched earth. She walked into Greeley's mercantile, dropped the bushel on the counter, and said in that honey and flint voice of hers, "2 bits a dozen. I got mouths to feed." Greeley, a man whose backbone was made mostly of soot and chewing tobacco, grunted and started counting. That's when he came in, dusty, lean, and taller than any man had a right to be. Long legs, worn boots, and a hat that had seen more road than rain. He didn't say much, just tipped his brim at Greeley and nodded at Ella. She looked up, slow and cautious, like a woman who'd learned to be wary of charm wrapped in a cowboy's coat. "You sellin' peaches?" he asked. She nodded. 2 bits a dozen." He pulled out a silver $50, dropped it on the counter, and took a dozen without a skin. Just like that. Then he turned to her, eyes like the deep water in a canyon, dark, still, and hard to read. "Name's Colt McAllister," he said. "Just passing through." Ella stared at him a beat too long. "Ain't much here to pass through to," she replied. He smiled faintly. Sometimes a man don't need a destination, just somewhere to stop a while. That was the first time he spoke to her, not the last. Over the next few weeks, folks started noticing Colt's horse tied up outside the Widow's Bluff property more than once. He'd show up around supper time with a sack of flour or some nails, help her fix a fence, or just sit a spell on her porch, drinking her iced chicory brew and listening to the wind. People started talking. Greeley said she was fooling herself, talking, in a drifter like that. "He'll be gone come September," he muttered over his beans one night at the saloon. "Mark my words." But folks like Greeley don't know nothing about the quiet kind of love that don't need loud declarations. They didn't see the way Colt looked at Ella when she wasn't watching, like he was trying to memorize her, afraid she'd vanish in a blink. Truth is, Colt had ghosts of his own. He never said where he came from or what he left behind, but the way he'd wake up screaming some nights in the old hayloft above the livery, you could tell he'd seen more than his share of hurt. One evening, the sun set in, like molasses poured over the hills. Ella handed Colt a hammer and asked him to mend a shutter that wouldn't stop banging in the breeze. He fixed it, then stood there leaning on the porch rail, staring out at the fields. "You ever think about staying?" she asked. He looked at her. "You ever think about a skin me too?" Neither of them said a word after that, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid. And just like that, summer kept rolling on. The wind shifted on the morning of August the 3rd, blowing in from the south with the breath of thunder on its back. Ella Mae Granger woke, with a strange feeling knotting in her chest, like the land itself was holding its breath. Colt had been around more regular by then, helping with the fence line, carrying buckets from the well, even taking her mule into town when its hoof cracked. But he still hadn't said much about who he was, or why he wandered so far west. Ella didn't press. Truth has a way of showing itself when the time's right. And besides, she had her own secrets buried deep beneath that prairie soil. That morning, while Colt was patching a corner of the barn roof, Ella stood watching the sky. Clouds were piling up over Widow's Bluff, black and mean. She wiped her hands on her apron and called up to him. "You best climb down, Colt. That sky's got murder in it." He looked up at the horizon and nodded slow. Ain't seen clouds like that since Texas. Twisters came calling, not long after. They secured what they could, barn doors latched, shutters drawn. Chickens ushered into the coop like children being tucked in for a rough night. By the time the first bolt of lightning cracked the sky open, they were both inside, huddled near the hearth. Ella sat on the floor, Colt beside her, back against the wall. The wind screamed like a banshee and rain pounded the roof, hard enough to make you think the Lord himself was knocking. The walls of that little cabin creaked and moaned, but they held, same as Ella. "You ever lose something in a storm?" she asked, voice barely more in a whisper. Colt nodded slow, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Lost my brother to one in Kansas. River jumped its banks, swept through our homestead like it had a score to settle. I was 16. He was 12. We buried him with a handful of rocks and a piece of my mama's quilt." Ella didn't speak right away. Then she reached over and took his hand. "I lost a child," she said. "3 winters back. Born too early. Ain't nothing crueler than a body bringing life into the world just to see it leave in the same breath." They sat there, hand in hand, the storm all around them. In that little room of wood and warmth, 2 wounded souls found a kind of peace. The storm didn't ask no questions. It didn't care what they'd done or lost. It just roared. When it passed, sometime near dawn, they stepped outside into a world scrubbed clean and raw. The peach trees were bent but standing, the chickens clucking like they'd survived a war. Ella looked at the sky, bright and blue again, like the storm had never been. Colt turned to her and said, "I never stayed in one place this long." Ella looked up at him, her face half in the sunlight. "I never let anyone stay this long." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. Sometimes the heart knows its own pace. By mid-August, the heat had settled over Widow's Bluff like a wet blanket, heavy and unmoving. The air smelled of wildflowers and sunburned grass, and each day brought a lull in chores just after high noon, when even the cicadas got too tired to hum. Ella Mae sat on the porch most afternoons, fanning herself with a hat and listening to the creak of the rocking chair her daddy built long before the war. Colt had taken to oiling her tools in the shade of the barn, quiet and methodical, as if the rhythm of farm life had gotten into his blood. That day, though, she noticed he wasn't moving with his usual calm. He'd been watching the road, muscles tight, eyes far off, like he was waiting on something. "You expecting trouble?" she asked, her voice casual but edged with curiosity. Colt didn't answer right away. He stood, brushed dust from his hands, and came to sit on the porch step. "I ain't used to feeling safe," he said finally, "and that makes me nervous." Ella lowered her fan. "Ain't no one out here but us and the cottonwoods." He looked at her, solemn. "That may be true, but ghosts ride hard sometimes." She studied him. "What kind of ghosts?" He picked up a piece of straw, rolled it between his fingers. "The kind that wear badges, or the kind that used to." That was the first time he'd said anything about his past. She waited, patient as a stone. "I used to be a deputy," he said, "back in New Mexico. Rode with a marshal named Harlan Jessup. He was fair, until he wasn't. Got too fond of power, too quick to draw. I saw him kill a man over a stolen mule. That's when I walked." Ella nodded slow, and the badge didn't take kindly to a man walking away. Cole gave a half-smile. "No, ma'am, it did not." They sat in silence for a time, the wind rustling the dry grass. A hawk circled overhead, casting a long shadow that glided across the ground like a whisper. "You got a middle name?" Ella asked, breaking the quiet. Colt chuckled softly. "Nope, just Colt McAllister. My pa said middle names were for men who needed savon. I reckon I was born past the point." Ella tilted her head. "Ain't nobody born past the point." Their eyes met. For a moment, the world seemed to still, like it was leaning in to hear what would be said next. But whatever might have passed between them was broken by the sound of hooves in the distance. Dust kicked up on the horizon. A rider, fast and hard. Colt stood jaw tight. "Stay inside," he said. She didn't argue. She knew better than to challenge a man who looked like he was about to face his own past. The rider came fast down the ridge, a blur of dust and horseflesh. By the time he hit the front gate of Widow's Bluff, Ella had one hand on the rifle behind the door and the other steadying her breath. Colt stood in the yard, legs apart, arms loose at his sides. He didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. The rider pulled up sharp, his mount lathered and breathing hard. He swung down, boot heels thudding into the dry earth, and removed his hat. Beneath it was a man with sunburnt skin, black hair tied back, and eyes hard as flint. "Been looking for you," he said. His voice had that lawman drawl, slow and sure. Colt nodded. "I figured. Harlan send you." The man smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Says you owe him. Says you ran out before the job was done." "I quit," Colt said, voice low. Didn't seem right, what he was a skin. The stranger glanced toward the porch. "He didn't take kindly to you going soft." Colt didn't flinch. "And I don't take kindly to folks threatening me on a woman's land." That seemed to amuse the man. He stepped closer, dust swirling around his boots. "You know Harlan. He don't forgive. He don't forget." Ella stepped onto the porch, rifle held steady. "And I don't much care for men talking about vengeance like it's church work." The stranger looked up at her, gave a slight nod. "You must be the reason Colt's got roots all of a sudden." "I'm the reason he's got something worth protecting," she said, cocking the hammer back. That hung in the air like gunpowder. Finally, the man in the blue duster turned back to Colt. "He wants you in El Paso by week's end. Or he sends someone less polite." Colt's jaw tightened. "You tell him if he comes, I won't run this time." The man tipped his hat to Ella. "Ma'am," he said, then mounted up and rode off, dust trail snake twisting behind him. When the sound of hooves faded, Ella lowered the rifle. "So," she said, "we expecting company?" Colt turned to her, weariness in his bones. "Looks that way." That night, they sat on the porch, watching the stars blink into view. The air smelled of sage and distant thunder. "Why didn't you ever go back?" she asked. Colt rubbed his hands together. "Because I knew one day I'd find something better." Ella looked at him sideways. "And have you?" He nodded, slow. "Every time I hear your voice in the morning, it reminds me why I stayed." She didn't answer, not in words. Just reached over, rested her hand atop his, and let the silence speak. But deep in the hills, trouble was riding. And it didn't care much about love stories or second chances. 3 nights after that dust-riding messenger delivered his warning, the prairie grew still in a way that made the crickets hush. Ella woke with a weight in her chest, the kind that comes before a storm, or a bullet. Colt was already dressed, sitting on the porch with his rifle across his knees, looking out over the moonlit fields like a man who'd already made peace with whatever was coming. "They'll come at night," he said, without tinning. "Men like Harlan always do." Ella stepped beside him, her shawl pulled tight. "How many?" "Don't know. But he don't send one man unless he's already sent a coffin." They'd spent the past days fortifying the property. Ella nailed shut the loose barn door, strung a line of bells across the fence line, and stacked the pantry with what little they could spare. Colt showed her how to load and clean the rifle, even though she already knew. Just never had reason to before. That night, the air hung thick with anticipation. The moon was high when the first bell rang. 3 riders came in slow, dark shapes against the wheat field, their shadows stretching long like ghosts. One called out, voice like a whip cracking through the stillness. "Colt McAllister, you got 10 seconds to come out, or we smoke you out." Colt stood, rifle steady, eyes calm. "Don't make this worse," he called back. No answer, just a single gunshot. The slug slammed into the porch post, throwing splinters like hornets. Ella dropped behind the doorframe, rifle in hand. Colt fired once, quick and clean. One rider yelped and fell, his horse rearing and bolting off into the dark. Then the real gunfight began. The night lit up with muzzle flashes. Bullets screamed through the still air. Ella fired from the window, heart pounding, breath steady. Colt moved with quiet fury, never wasting a shot. After what felt like a lifetime, the last shot echoed out across the fields, and silence returned. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence of what's left behind. Colt stepped off the porch, gun still raised. One man was dead. Another crawled, blood leaking from his shoulder. The third never made it past the bell line. Ella followed him down. "You all right?" she asked. He looked at her, really looked, and nodded. "I am now." She took his hand, her fingers tight around his. "You don't have to leave," she said, voice low. "I know," he replied, "but I might still have to fight." Come morning, the sun rose over Widow's Bluff, casting long light over the bodies in the field and the bullet-scarred porch. But inside that little house, two souls sat side by side, bruised but unbroken. Colt buried the dead man just past the peach trees, under the old cottonwood that hadn't borne fruit in years, said a few quiet words, then stood back while the wind picked up and swept the dust over the fresh-turned earth like a blanket. Ella watched from the porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't ask who the man was. Didn't need to. When a man rides with a price on his head, he makes peace with the fact that sooner or later he'll have to dig a grave with his own hands. By week's end, the town had heard about the shootout. Sheriff Townsend rode up one morning, a Bible in his saddlebag and a question in his eyes. He and Colt talked for a long while by the fence. Ella couldn't hear what was said, but when the sheriff left, he tipped his hat to her and said, "You've got a good man here." She nodded slow. "I know." That afternoon, Colt finally told her the rest. About the raid in El Paso. About the boy who got caught in the crossfire. About how Marshal Harlan covered it up, blamed the locals, and sent Colt to kill a man he knew was innocent. And how Colt rode away instead. "I figured if I disappeared, the world might forget me," he said, sitting at the table, eyes on his hands. But ghosts got long memories. Ella placed a cup of coffee in front of him, sat down across the table. "You didn't run. You walked away from something rotten. There's a difference." He looked up, eyes tired but grateful. "And you ever think about leaving this place?" Ella smiled faintly. "I did once. When my husband died, folks told me to sell. Start fresh in San Antonio. I almost did, but the soil here knows me. And now so do you." Colt reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "You saved me, Ella. I didn't come here looking for salvation, but I reckon I found it anyway." That night they danced. No music, no steps, just Colt taking her hand on the porch while the wind rustled the dry grass, her head on his shoulder, his arms around her waist. A dance for the sake of breathing, for the feel of being alive. But peace don't last long on the prairie. Come morning, they found a fresh boot print by the barn. Heavy, deep, not Colt's. Someone else was coming. It was the second Thursday of August when Ella found the second boot print. This one was closer to the window, right where she'd left her wash basin the night before. The dust had been disturbed, like someone had been watching. Maybe longer than they knew. Colt spent the morning checking the property line, eyes narrowed, shoulders tight as fence wire. He didn't say much, but Ella could tell. He knew who it was. When the sun reached its high point, he came back to the porch, took off his hat, and sat with a sigh. "It's Harlan," he said. Ella didn't flinch. "You sure?" Colt nodded. "That kind of print. Heel heavy, toe light. Man favors his left leg. Used to call it his lucky limp. Said he got Fallon off a saloon balcony chasing some gambler's wife." Ella's mouth tightened. "Sounds like a real prize." "Oh, he's worse than that," Colt said. "He don't kill for justice. He kills for pride. And he's coming for me, not because I ran, but because I made him look small in front of the badge." That night, Colt packed a small satchel. Bullets, some jerky, a flask. He set it on the porch steps. "I'm gonna meet him before he gets here," he told her. "Spare you the wreckage." Ella stepped in front of him, arms crossed. "You think I built all this just to watch it burn? You think I let you in so you could leave when it gets hard?" He looked down, jaw clenched. "I've stood through drought, death, and heartbreak, Colt McAllister," she said, voice like flint. "I ain't about to fall apart now." Colt stared at her for a long time. Then, slow as a sunrise, he sat back down and took her hand. "Then we face him together." The next day passed quiet. Too quiet. Even the crows stayed off the fence posts. When dusk came, so did the sound of hoofbeats. Ella and Colt stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the bluff, rifles in hand. A single rider approached, black coat flapping behind him, spurs gleaming with every slow step. Marshal Harlan Jessup looked like he was carved from scorched wood, tall, lean, and hollow-eyed. He rode with the confidence of a man who never had to run from anything. He stopped 10 paces out. "Evening, Colt," he called. "Evening, Harlan. You didn't answer my message." "I thought the answer was clear." Harlan smiled, thin and cruel. "Still got a woman protecting you?" Ella stepped forward. "He don't need protecting. But I'll die before I let another man tear something good out of this place." The smile faded. "Reckon that's a fine sentiment," Harlan said, drawing his revolver with a fluid motion. But Colt was faster. The shot rang out sharp as a whip. Harlan's gun hit the dirt. His horse reared, and the marshal fell backwards, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Colt holstered his revolver. Ella didn't move. Harlan gasped once. Then the prairie swallowed the sound. The prairie was quiet after the shot, like the land itself was holding its breath. Colt stood with his gun lowered, smoke drifting from the barrel like a spirit leaving the body. Harlan Jessup lay still on the dry earth, a man who'd thought he was too mean to die. Ella moved first. Steady steps. She knelt beside the marshal, checked for a pulse. There was none. She looked up at Colt, eyes unreadable. "You all right?" He nodded, but the nod was heavy. "I didn't want to kill him, but I couldn't let him take me back." Ella stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "You didn't kill him for yourself," she said. "You killed him for us." They buried Harlan at the edge of the property, just far enough to forget, not so far they'd pretend it hadn't happened. Colt built a cross himself, plain wood, no name. Ella brought a wildflower and laid it at the base. The next days moved slow. Word hadn't reached town yet, and they took that time to breathe. For the first time, they spoke like folks with a future. One morning, Colt brought her a ring. It wasn't store-bought or polished, just a thin band of beaten silver, shaped by his own hands, melted down from the last bullet in his belt. "I ain't got much," he said, "but what I have I give you." Ella held it in her palm a long time before slipping it on. "Then we both give all we got. That's enough." They married under the cottonwood tree, the same one where the first rider was buried. Just the two of them, the wind and the wild sky. He promised her no lies. She promised him no leaving. That night, they sat on the porch, hand in hand, watching the stars. "You think they'll come looking for Harlan?" she asked. "Maybe," Colt said, "but maybe they won't. Maybe the world's had its fill of men like him." Ella smiled faintly. "Let's hope." He leaned his head against hers. "And if not?" She nodded toward the rifle near the door. "Then we'll be ready." A month passed. The sun softened just a little, and the first yellow leaves curled along the edge of the bluff, warning of fall. Life at Widow's Bluff settled into something folks might call peace, though Ella and Colt knew better. Peace out here was just calm between storms. Colt took to fixing the windmill that hadn't worked since Ella's first husband passed. Said he needed the work of his hands to quiet the rest of him. Ella didn't ask what haunted his sleep, but she held him through every restless night, every sigh that slipped from his lips like a name he wouldn't speak. They planted late corn and turned the soil by lantern light. They cooked simple meals, shared coffee on the porch, and read books with frayed covers by the fire. There was no grand adventure, no riches, no music but the wind and the coyotes. But it was home. Then came the letter. A rider from Sulphur Springs brought it in a dust-slicked envelope, edges curled, the ink smudged by heat and miles. It was from Colt's younger sister, Lila, out of New Mexico. He hadn't heard from her in near 10 years. Thought maybe she'd gone east. Thought maybe she'd died. "She's got a child now," he said, reading the words aloud slow. "A girl named Mercy. Says her husband passed from the fever, and she's lost the land. She's a skin if she can come." Ella looked up from the skillet, wiped her hands on a cloth. "She got a place here if she wants it." Colt nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "You sure? It's a lot." Ella stepped close, laid a hand over his heart. This place was built on loss and made into love. That's something worth sharing. And so it was decided. They cleaned out the old room near the back. Ella mended the bed frame. Colt strung a new line for the clothes. The house stirred with a sense of purpose again, the way an old dog perks up when it knows company's coming. A week later, Lila arrived, thin, hollow-eyed, but with a child clinging to her skirts and the look of a woman who'd fought to the edge and back. Colt swept her up in a hug that cracked the shell of years. Ella took the little girl's hand and led her to the peach tree. "This here," she said. "This is where we start again." And for the first time since that summer began, Ella looked at her land and saw not survival, but legacy. The days that followed were golden and slow. The kind of days folks look back on when life gets too sharp. Mercy, with her wild curls and bright eyes, took to the prairie like she was born from its dust, climbing trees, chasing grasshoppers, and to skin more questions than a schoolhouse full of scholars. Ella taught her how to knead bread and gather eggs without spooking the hens. Colt taught her how to sit a saddle and watch the wind for signs. Lila, though still quiet and worn, began to smile again, especially when the girl would run and carry in a frog or a flower like it was gold. One afternoon in late September, Colt and Ella sat side by side on the porch, watching the child play by the peach tree. The sun dipped low, casting everything in that warm, honey light, the kind of light that makes shadows softer and hearts fuller. "You ever think we'd end up like this?" Ella asked. Colt shook his head. "Didn't think I'd live long enough to end up anywhere." She reached over, laced her fingers with his. "You gave me more than I ever asked for." He looked at her with that slow, quiet gaze she'd come to know better than her own reflection. "You gave me a reason to stay." That night, as they sat around a small fire, Mercy climbed into Colt's lap, clutching a blanket Ella had sewn from old scraps. "Tell me a story," the girl said, eyes wide. Colt cleared his throat, a bit shy. "Well, there once was a cowboy, dusty and worn. Folks called him a wanderer, said he didn't have a heart left to break." "What happened?" Mercy whispered. Colt smiled. "He found a woman stronger than the prairie, and she taught him how to build something instead of run." Ella leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice soft. "And he never broke her heart." Colt kissed her brow, voice low. "Not once." Years later, folks would pass Widow's Bluff and point to the house with the white shutters and the tall peach trees. They'd say a woman lived there who took in strays, men, children, even ghosts, and turned them into family. And they'd say the man who stayed by her side was once just a dusty cowboy riding away from something. But she gave him a home, and in return, he gave her a love that never cracked, never faded, and never once broke her heart.